What that tends to do then is create certain kinds of temptations for conservatives when they engage in the originalist enterprise. One of those temptations is to deviate from originalism and to find various kinds of strategies for thinking about when do we not have to adhere to original meaning. Is it okay at certain moments to think about other kinds of commitments rather than original meaning, whether those other commitments are adherence to precedent and stare decisis, whether those other commitments are to look for pragmatic concerns and policy commitments that are particularly valuable, whether they're to look for other kinds of values in the Constitution or outside the Constitution that we think are particularly important besides simply originalism. So do we wind up melding originalism to a set of other kinds of arguments or concerns besides originalism itself, whether those are explicit or implicit at the end of the day. So in Scalia's language, to take one version of it, do we become faint-hearted originalists when push comes to shove, whether because we don't want to be nuts, or in the alternative simply because there are things we like and want to accomplish from a policy or political perspective, and originalism is getting in the way. Alternatively, we skew the historical results. We squint when looking at the historical record, and we figure out ways of making historical arguments that seem to come up with the answers that we like, rather than come up with the answers that we don't like. So we claim that we, in fact, are still being originalists, we're still engaged in the originalist enterprise, and yet come up with answers that are consistent with our political and policy preferences today. Both those temptations, I would think, should be avoided, but that requires an argument as to why those temptations should be avoided. The first temptation's a more complicated argument than the second temptation, but ultimately both require arguments about why they ought to be avoided. What they also, though, call our attention to is we shouldn't expect the Constitution to be a perfect fit from a conservative perspective, or perfect in general. It doesn't provide all the answers that we would like from the perspective of any current political program, from any particular ideological perspective, and it doesn't provide answers at all. In many cases. There are many contemporary political questions that we would like answers to, that we need answers to in order to move forward on particular policy or political issues that the Constitution simply isn't clear on or simply doesn't speak to at all. And we should be prepared for the fact that the Constitution either is going to disappoint us by providing the wrong answers from our perspective, or is going to disappoint us by not providing any answers at all. And sometimes that means we have to make our own choices in the world. And from an originalist perspective, we need to deal with that both politically but also theoretically. So let me just say something briefly then about originalism as a political theory and what that means relative to conservatism. So that's all about originalism as a practice and what the implications of that might be as a rationalization for conservatism. But it's also true that originalism exists as a kind of political theory. That is, why might we be originalist, and what are the kinds of arguments associated with why we might be originalists, and why might those arguments appeal more sometimes to conservatives than they might to liberals. So even if you can get around, or might liberals get around concerns about what the outcomes of particular cases might be, would there still be resistance to being an originalist? Would you prefer to be something else simply because of the underlying political theory associated with originalism? At this point, there are multiple political theories that people offer about why one might be an originalist, but one of the prominent ones, and the one I think tends to be correct, is that it's grounded in theories of popular sovereignty, that you ought to be an originalist because the original Constitution is democratically authorized by certain lawmakers who had authority to create that constitutional text. Now, in some senses, that tends to be fairly radical. That is, it puts a certain priority on democracy, and it puts a certain priority on that particular text. It means it's possible for new lawmakers to come along and write new text that you would have to obey and give authority to. It also means that that text can trump other things, like, for example, precedent and tradition that has been built up over time, and that can have some radical consequences at times. But on the other hand, it can also have certain kinds of conservative tendencies. That it tends to be backward-looking. It requires that judges and other constitutional interpreters think backwards to the past toward those particular democratic lawmakers who passed that particular text. It's also outward-looking. Instead of asking judges to think about what they think would be right to do in particular circumstances, it requires that they think about what those democratic lawmakers thought was the right constitutional rule to adopt in that particular circumstances, and then implement that constitutional rule rather than what they tend to think is the right constitutional rule. And as I noted, some are going to simply be philosophically disinclined to adopt that kind of perspective on what judges ought to do in general, and to adopt that kind of perspective on what the Constitution is all about, what kind of authority the Constitution tends to have over us. But I think it's the right kind of way to think about what the Constitution is from an originalist perspective. Now, as I noted, there's some aspects of that that are somewhat conservative. There are other aspects of that that are not particularly conservative. But if you're attracted to that kind of theory about constitutionalism and judicial review generally, that's going to attract you towards some vision of originalism, and some are going to find that appealing, but others are going to resist it and are going to want to say that regardless of what originalism means as a practice relative to certain kinds of cases, that they're going to want to look for some other theory about judicial review and constitutionalism more generally that's going to take them in a different direction away from originalism more broadly. Thank you.